3,200 years ago, the most powerful empire the ancient world had produced did not merely fall, it was erased. Erased so completely that later civilizations forgot it had ever existed. The Hittites fought Egypt to a standstill. They ruled Anatolia for 5 centuries. They wrote to pharaohs as equals, brother to brother. And then their capital emptied, their archives fell silent, and the empire was simply gone, its very name lost for 3,000 years. For a century, historians could only guess why. Broken pottery, burned walls, and the boastful stone of Egyptian propaganda could never answer the real question: what force could erase an empire this strong? Here is what makes it the greatest mystery of the Bronze Age. The answer was never in the ruins at all. It was hidden in tree rings, in buried archives, and an ancient human bone. It is surfacing now. To understand why the disappearance of the Hittites is so unsettling, you first have to understand what disappeared. And what disappeared was not a minor kingdom on the edge of the map. It was a superpower. For roughly 5 centuries, from around 1650 to 1200 before the Common Era, the Hittites ruled the harsh, semi-arid heart of Anatolia, the highland plateau that makes up much of modern Turkey. They were not one power among many. They were one of the 4 great powers of the age, standing alongside Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon as equals, and they proved it on the battlefield. Around 1274 before the Common Era, the Hittite king Mu'attali II met Ramesses II of Egypt near the Syrian city of Kadesh. What followed was one of the largest chariot battles ever fought. Ramesses carved his walls with the story of a glorious Egyptian triumph, as pharaohs always did. But the ground told a different story. Neither side could break the other. The greatest army Egypt could field had marched north to crush the Hittites and had been fought to a bloody standstill. What came next mattered even more than the battle. Around 1259 before the Common Era, Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusa III signed a treaty, not a surrender, a peace between equals, dividing the ancient world between them. That document survives today. It is the oldest known peace treaty in human history, and a copy of it hangs at the headquarters of the United Nations in New York. Think about what that means. The words of a vanished empire still hang on the wall of the modern world's parliament. The Hittites did not just fight as equals. They spoke as equals. In the diplomatic letters found at Amarna in Egypt, the great kings of the age address one another as brothers, trading gifts, complaining about late shipments of gold, arranging royal marriages. The king of the Hittites sat at that table by right. At the center of it all stood their capital, Hattusa, a city ringed by massive stone walls, studded with temple complexes and monumental gates carved with lions and warriors. Inside its archives lay tens of thousands of clay tablets, an entire civilization's memory pressed into wet clay and baked hard. Their world was governed by a vast pantheon, with a storm god at its head, a belief system we know today only as documented Hittite religion, recorded in their own hand, never confirmed as anything more. And then all of it stopped. Here is the detail that turns a collapse into a mystery. When an empire is conquered, someone inherits the throne. A new dynasty takes the palace, keeps the roads, claims the glory. That is not what happened here. No triumphant successor stepped into the Hittite crown. The state simply dissolved, and its very name fell out of human memory so completely that for 3,000 years, almost nobody knew the Hittites had ever existed. They survived only as a strange word in the Hebrew Bible, a people no historian could place. Then, in 1834, a French explorer named Charles Texier rode into the Anatolian countryside and found the ruins of an enormous ancient city. Vast walls, carved gateways, a dead capital sprawling across the hills. He had no idea whose it was. It would take decades more to prove that Texir had walked into the wreckage of a forgotten superpower. But that only sharpened the question: how does an empire this powerful vanish so completely? To answer that, you have to look at the world it belonged to. The Hittites did not fall alone. They fell as part of a world. And to understand their end, you have to understand how tightly that world was bound together and how quietly fragile all of it was. In 1984, divers working off the coast of southwestern Turkey began raising the remains of a ship from the seabed near a promontory called Uluburun. The vessel had gone down more than 3,000 years earlier. What it carried stopped researchers cold. In its hold lay copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from the mountains of Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic coast, ivory from Africa, pottery from Greece, glass, gold, and precious goods from a dozen kingdoms. A single ship, barely 15 meters long, carrying the material output of half the known world. That wreck is not an oddity, it is a portrait. By the 14th and 13th centuries before the Common Era, the great powers of the Eastern Mediterranean had built something the world had never seen before: a system. Egypt in the south, the Hittites commanding Anatolia, the Mycenaeans in Greece, Babylon and Assyria anchoring the east, and smaller, wealthy kingdoms threading the connections between them. These powers traded with each other, wrote to each other, married into each other. They had woven themselves into a single fabric. And here is the flaw hidden inside that achievement. The thing that made their armies possible was bronze. Bronze required tin, and tin came almost entirely from a single distant source, the mountains of Afghanistan, thousands of kilometers away. Every sword, every spearhead, every scrap of armor in Egypt, in Greece, in Hattusa, depended on a supply line stretching across the entire continent. Remove one link in that chain, and the flow slowed. Remove several at once, and the whole structure began to buckle. The weapon that this system fielded made the fragility worse. The chariot was the tank of the Bronze Age, fast and devastating and almost impossible to counter in open ground. But a chariot was not cheap. You needed trained horses, skilled craftsmen, professional warriors, and a surplus economy just to put one in the field. The chariot locked military power into a technology only rich, stable states could afford, which meant the moment those states stopped being rich and stable, their entire way of making war would collapse with them. For a long time, none of this seemed to matter. The system was too big, too wealthy, too deeply connected to fail. And then, in the closing decades of the 13th century before the Common Era, the reports coming in from across that world began to darken. Famine was gnawing at the Hittite highlands, year after year. Grain that had once flowed freely now had to be begged for and shipped in from Egypt to keep the population alive. In Greece, the great palace fortresses were extending their walls and thickening their defenses, the unmistakable archaeological signature of people who had begun to feel genuinely afraid. And from the coastal kingdom of Ugarit came letters carrying a new and terrible urgency. The ships of the enemy, the king wrote, had been seen. Read those letters now, and the dread is still legible. Something was moving across the sea. Something was already breaking on the land. And nobody who wrote those words understood the full scale of what was coming. Here is what almost no one appreciated until very recently. The first thing to fail was not the army, and it was not the enemy at the gate. It was the rain. And the proof of it was still growing, ring by ring, inside the trees. For over a century, the collapse of the Hittites was argued over with broken pottery and burned brick. The real evidence was somewhere no one thought to look. It was locked inside the wood of ancient trees, waiting for science to learn how to read it. In February of 2023, in a study published in the journal Nature, a team led by Sturt Manning and Jed Sparks of Cornell University did exactly that. Their material was extraordinary. Buried inside a great mound at Gordian in central Anatolia, a 50-meter earthwork raised over an ancient tomb, lay timbers of juniper wood. Some of those trees had been alive at the very moment the Hittite world came apart, roughly 230 kilometers from the capital at Hattusa. They were witnesses. They just had to be questioned correctly. The method rested on two independent signals locked in every ring. The first was width. In a good year, a tree lays down a broad ring. In a year of drought, it lays down a narrow one, a thin, starved band that marks a tree fighting simply to stay alive. The second signal was chemical. The ratio of two forms of carbon absorbed into each ring records how much moisture the tree could draw from the soil that season. Width told them the tree was struggling. The carbon told them why. Two separate lines of evidence pointing in exactly the same direction. And the direction was terrifying. The wood recorded a general shift toward drier conditions across the later 13th century, a slow tightening of the land. Then it recorded something far worse. 3 consecutive years of severe, catastrophic drought, centered on roughly 1198, 1197, and 1196 before the Common Era, give or take 3 years. 3 failed harvests in a row. And that window landed almost exactly on the disappearance of the Hittite Empire. To understand why 3 dry years could break a superpower, you have to remember where the Hittites lived. Their heartland was the semi-arid Anatolian plateau, land that was hard to feed even in good years. This was an empire that already imported grain across enormous distances just to survive. For centuries, it had endured single bad harvests. Its whole civilization was built on resilience, on the ability to absorb one lean year and recover. But resilience has a limit. 1 year of drought is a hardship. 2 years is a crisis. 3 years, striking an empire whose reserves were already thin and whose grain lifelines were already fraying, is something a state may simply not survive. Manning himself has been careful, and that caution matters. He does not claim proof. As he has put it, there are no eyewitness accounts, and so the drought cannot be positively welded to the fall. What he calls it instead is an extraordinary coincidence, a moment when the climate turned savage at precisely the point the empire vanished. That is the honest scientific position, not a verdict. A convergence so tight it is almost impossible to look away from, and it reframes everything. The famine gnawing at the Hittite highlands in those final decades was not a run of bad luck. It was the leading edge of a climate event severe enough to leave its fingerprint in the rings of trees 3,000 years later. The rain failed first, the fields failed next, and an empire that had weathered every storm the ancient world could throw at it finally met a drought it could not outlast. But drought explains the starving countryside. It does not explain the strangest discovery of all. Because when archaeologists finally dug into the capital itself, what they found made no sense. For generations, the end of Hattusa was told as a single violent night. Invaders at the walls, fire in the temples, the capital of a superpower stormed and put to the torch, its people cut down in the streets. It is a vivid picture. It is also almost certainly wrong. The excavations at Hattusa have run for over a century, and since 2006 they have been led by Andreas Schachner of the German Archaeological Institute, building on the earlier work of his predecessor Jürgen Seeher. Between them, these archaeologists have taken the burned capital apart layer by layer, and what they found rewrote the story of its final hours. Yes, Hattusa burned. Early in the 12th century, before the Common Era, fire swept through the great buildings of the city. That much is real, written in scorched stone and blackened debris. But the fire is not the discovery. The discovery is what was missing before the fire ever started. When the flames came, the city was already empty of everything that mattered. The royal family was gone. The elite were gone. The treasuries had been cleared of their valuables. And most telling of all, the archives, Those tens of thousands of clay tablets that held the memory of the empire had been stripped of their most important records before the burning. Somebody had carried the crown jewels and the state's memory out of the city in an orderly fashion, long before any torch was lit. Let that detail settle. This was not a capital caught by surprise and overwhelmed. This was a capital that had been deliberately evacuated. The Hittite state did not die at Hattusa. The Hittite state walked out of Hattusa, packed and prepared, and only afterward did the empty shell of the city burn. The destruction everyone imagined as the cause was really the epilogue. The fire came after the story was already over, and the abandonment was not sudden. The evidence points to a gradual emptying, a decline stretched across decades, as the population drained away and the great capital slowly hollowed out from the inside. An empire does not do this by accident. It does this when the center can no longer hold, when the reasons to stay have quietly evaporated one by one. Here is what makes it stranger still. Hattusa had been abandoned before and had survived. Centuries earlier, around the 14th century, the Hittite king Tudaliya III had been forced to give up the capital entirely, as enemies pressed in from every direction, including the Cascade tribes who came down out of the northern mountains. That earlier abandonment was a catastrophe, and the Hittites recovered from it. They took their capital back. They rebuilt. They rose again to fight Egypt to a standstill. So the walking away by itself was not a death sentence. The Hittites had done it once and returned. The pressure from the north was real. The Cascade were a genuine and recurring threat, but the empire had faced all of that before and endured. This time was different. This time there was no return, no rebuilding, no resurgent kingdom. The state left its 1,000-year capital and simply never came back. And that is the question the burned stones cannot answer on their own. An empire does not calmly evacuate the beating heart of its civilization because of a single enemy at the gate. It does that when staying has become impossible for reasons far larger than any army. So what force was large enough to do that? The answer is that it was never one force at all. It was everything, arriving at once. Here is where the simple story finally breaks apart. For a long time, the fall of the Hittites was pinned on a single villain, one enemy, one invasion, one clean cause. The more carefully researchers have looked, the more that story has dissolved. What killed the Hittites was not a blow, it was a cascade. The archaeologist Eric Klein has framed this as a systems collapse, and the phrase is exact. Picture not one crisis but many, arriving faster than any of them could be answered. Drought, earthquake, severed trade, revolt from within, and desperate people on the move, all striking a single interconnected world in the same narrow window of years. Pull any one thread and the empire might have held. Pull all of them at once and the whole fabric came apart. Start with the ground itself. Seismologists studying the 12th century before the Common Era have found a remarkable clustering of major earthquakes across Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant, a seismic storm rolling through the region in the very decades of the collapse. At several sites, the destruction layers carry the specific signature of earthquake damage rather than deliberate burning. And it is worth noting where the shaking did not reach. Egypt sat largely outside that seismic zone, which may be part of why Egypt, alone among the great powers, managed to survive. Then there was the tin. Remember that bronze required tin, and tin came from thousands of kilometers away. When the long overland routes carrying it westward were disrupted, the effect rippled through every palace and every army that depended on it. The weapons stopped coming. The system that made war possible began to starve. And then there is the most unsettling detail of all. At several sites, the palaces burned while the ordinary settlements around them did not. That is not the pattern of a foreign army sweeping through and torching everything in its path. That is the pattern of people who knew exactly what they wanted to destroy. In some places, the collapse came from inside, from populations turning on the palace authority that had failed to feed and protect them. Only now, against all of that, do the famous invaders enter the story. The Sea Peoples. Around 1177 before the Common Era, Ramesses III of Egypt recorded a massive assault by a confederation of seaborne warriors, and his predecessor Merneptah had already turned back a similar force decades earlier. These were not simply raiders. Carved into the temple walls at Medinet Habu, alongside the warships and the fighting men, are ox carts loaded with women, children, and household possessions. This was migration in force. Whole peoples on the move, carrying everything they owned, looking for somewhere to land. But here's the correction that changes everything. The Sea Peoples were not the cause of the collapse. They were as much its symptom. Wolves circling a wounded animal, not a healthy one. Many of them were themselves fleeing the same drought, the same failing harvests, the same disintegrating world. They did not arrive and topple a thriving empire. They arrived at the exact moment of maximum weakness, drawn to a world already tearing itself apart from drought and quake and hunger and revolt. So the search for a single killer was doomed from the start. There was no one enemy. There was a drought that starved the fields, an earthquake storm that cracked the cities, a broken supply chain that disarmed the armies, and a wave of displaced humanity crashing against it all at once. The empire did not lose a war. It lost everything, everywhere, together. There is one more line of evidence, and it is the newest of all. Not pottery, not burned brick, not tree rings. It is written in human bone, and it answers a question the collapse always left hanging. What happened to the people caught in the wreckage of that world? Be clear about one thing first. The sharpest genetic answer we have does not come from the Hittites themselves. It comes from one of the peoples swept up in the same catastrophe, the Philistines, the group with the strongest archaeological link to the Sea Peoples. That is where the DNA speaks loudest, and it is worth being honest about the difference. In 2019, in the journal Science Advances, a team led by Michael Feldman and Johannes Kraus published genome-wide data from 10 individuals buried at Ashkelon on the coast of the Levant, spanning the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. And the moment they compared the layers, a signal jumped out. In the earliest Iron Age burials, right around the time the Philistines appear, there was a component of ancestry that had simply not existed in the population before. It was European. Its closest matches pointed toward the Aegean and to places like Crete, Iberia, and Sardinia. This was not a faint statistical whisper. It was a genuine biological discontinuity. A population that had not been there in the Bronze Age was suddenly present in the Iron Age, carrying ancestry from across the sea. For the first time, the bones confirmed what the broken pottery and the changed diets had only suggested. People had actually crossed the Mediterranean and settled on that shore, exactly when the collapse was scattering populations in every direction. And then comes the detail that makes this human rather than merely scientific. That European signal did not last. Within 2 or 3 generations, it fades. By the later Iron Age layers at Ashkelon, it has blended almost entirely into the surrounding Levantine population. The newcomers did not stay a sealed community, walled off from the world they had entered. They arrived, they settled, they married in, and the boundary dissolved. Their identity survived in culture and memory long after it had vanished from their blood. What the DNA does not show is just as important. There is no single unified genetic signature running across all the Sea Peoples. No shared homeland, no one originating population. They were genuinely multiple peoples, drawn from within the Mediterranean world itself, not some ghost civilization arriving from beyond the edge of the map. The genetics confirm what the most careful archaeology already implied. These were not aliens who destroyed a world. They were products of that world, coming apart at the seams and washing up on distant shores. And the Hittites. What became of them was not annihilation either. The empire dissolved, but the people did not evaporate. They dispersed into the smaller Neo-Hittite kingdoms that rose across Anatolia and northern Syria in the centuries after, carrying the language, the gods, the memory of Hattusa forward in fragments. A state had vanished, a population endured, folded into whatever came next. That is the quiet revelation underneath all of it. Nobody was erased in blood. The Hittites were not slaughtered out of existence, and the Sea Peoples were not a demonic tide from nowhere. A system died. The web of trade and power that had bound the Bronze Age together broke, and the human beings inside it did what human beings always do. They fled, they adapted, they intermarried, they survived. Even a diluted thread of that ancient ancestry lingers in the region today, carried quietly in living people who have no idea they hold it. So return to the question we began with. What force could erase the most powerful empire of the ancient world? The answer is that no single force did. The Hittites were not struck down by one sword or one enemy. They were undone from within, by 3 years without rain, by an earthquake storm that cracked their cities, by a snapped supply line that disarmed their armies, with the Sea Peoples arriving only to push a body already falling. Scientists went looking for a villain. What they found was a cascade. And in the rings of a single juniper tree and the DNA of a handful of buried bones, they found something stranger than any invasion. A mirror. The Anatolian soil is still giving up its archives, and the picture sharpens every year. The greatest empire of its age was outlasted by 3 dry years. It took 3,000 years and a dead tree to finally say so.